Sorry, let me start that again and just introduce myself to you all. My name is Ruth Citron. I am the Executive Director of the Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Research Program, otherwise known as XCEPT. This is a UK aid funded program. I'm very pleased to be joining you today to moderate our session that brings together findings from multiple studies and pilot programming among youth in areas formerly held by the Islamic State, otherwise known as Daesh, in northeast Syria and Iraq. Our panelists, we have 3 panelists and a discussant today. Our panelists, actually we have 4 panelists, will each share some key takeaways from their research and offer considerations for policy and programming. What I'd like to do first, and Alex, if you can put the first XCEPT program slide on, is just briefly introduce the XCEPT research program. I know there are a lot of you on the call. Many of you have not yet come across the XCEPT program, so it behooves me to take a minute to just introduce ourselves and what we do. Our research, again funded by UK aid, really focuses on what connects conflicts across borders, what drives violent and peaceful behavior, and how policy responses should adapt. We have an array of researchers working in this program, an array of institutions that I'll show you in a minute, but they engage in mixed methods research that focuses on field data collection, both qualitative and quantitative, and using innovative methods such as satellite data and open source investigations and other forms of open data to help build understanding of hard to access or conflict affected areas. We deliver research for policy audiences, but also for public good and for experts and practitioners. And our program includes a flexible research fund that allows us to commission additional research on emerging issues and some of the program's core topics. Alex, if you can move to the next slide, just showing the key questions of our research. I thought it would be useful just to start to give you a sense of our the primary topics that we focus on. And first, it's about our understanding of what connects conflicts across borders. And secondly, it's really about some behavioral research about what drives violent, peaceful behavior. There's a third element to this that's also incredibly important, which is how do policy responses need to adapt? Sorry, I just need to go back to my notes. It's not allowing me to do. Let's go to the next slide. This map, the map you're seeing here, is actually giving you a sense of the scope of our work. We really have partners working across North Africa, through the Horn of Africa, up the Middle East and over to Asia. And we just wanted to show that to give you an initial sense of XCEPT's breadth. Next slide, please. Now, let's turn to the agenda for the main event today. We're really focused on Syria and Iraq, or particularly northeast Syria and parts of Iraq held by Daesh. We're going to begin with a presentation from XCEPT research team members, Dr. Hayat and Alex Fisher. They'll talk about field data collection undertaken by the XCEPT research team in parts of northeast Syria. The research was focused on understanding the impact of conflict and violent extremism on adolescents, and bringing forward some considerations for programming to help support adolescents in these areas and prevent resurgent violence and violent extremism. Just to introduce, what I'll do as I'm going through this agenda is introduce now our speakers, so you have a sense of who we're bringing together today. Hayat is a Syrian columnist and a consulting fellow for the Chatham House Middle East North Africa program. He's previously worked with the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London, one of the partners in the research program, as is Chatham House, and has also worked in the field as a program manager on Syria and Iraq with the Heinrich Boll Stiftung Middle East office in Beirut. Alex is a research manager with XCEPT. He has overseen the delivery of this particular study on northeast Syria, and he brings to it more than a decade of experience managing research and programming for governments and development organizations, with most of his work focusing on Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. The second presentation we're going to have today is from Professor Kelsey Shanks of the University of Ulster. She's going to offer comments on research she has undertaken and led on developing education programming for adolescents in former Daesh-held areas of Iraq. Kelsey holds the UNESCO Chair in Education and for Peacebuilding and Human Rights at, as I said, the University of Ulster. Her work focuses on the relationship between education and conflict in divided societies. And her presentation today is going to reflect multiple studies that she's led for UNESCO and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Third, Dr. Carolyn Hoy will share findings from recent Mercy Corps research and pilot programming in Northeast Syria that is focused on preventing violent extremism and promoting social cohesion. Carolyn is the Syria Program Director at Mercy Corps. She's a specialist on monitoring, evaluation, research, and learning for international development. And her recent work has been focused on Syria and Jordan, but she also has experience in Afghanistan. This is both with through Mercy Corps and with her work for the UK government. And then finally, before we open the floor to questions and discussion, we've asked Patrick Marianne of the UK government's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office to offer some thoughts and considerations from a policy perspective. Patrick is the UK government's conflict advisor for Northeast Syria. He leads on program development with a particular focus on stabilization and violence prevention programming. He's worked more than 10 years with the UK government on conflict governance and security and justice programs in the Middle East, Africa, and other parts of Asia. And he came to the FCDO with a background in peace building and development in Africa. So just before I hand the floor to Alex and Hyatt, what I'd like to do, because we have a lot of participants on the Zoom call, and I just want to go through a few notes on how we'd like to work it, because we want to make it as participatory as possible. First, as you may have heard when we started the call, that this presentation is being recorded. We hope that poses no issues for anyone. And then what you'll see on the Zoom window, that there's two functions enabled. First, there's a question and answer function that we'll be monitoring. So please, if you have questions for the panelists, use this function to type in your questions, and we'll aggregate them and come back to them in the discussion. We know there's some members of the research team, the wider research team, and others who might want to come online with a comment. Just flag in the Q&A the moment you're ready to offer some thoughts that relate to the discussion, and we'll turn your mic on. For those of you that are enabled with that function, please do, after you've offered your comment, go back off. Please remember to mute your mic so that we avoid the background noise. The second thing you'll see in the Zoom window is a chat function. We're well aware we have policy officers on the line, we have a range of experts on the line, we have practitioners on the line, and you all have something to say about this topic, and you all have useful observations to offer. So we wanted to have the chat there so that you could respond to the panelists' comments. You could respond to each other's comments. It's trying in a way, if we were all sitting in the same room, to enable a conversation. So please feel free to use the chat function throughout and to use the Q&A function to put in those direct questions that you want the panelists to answer. And then one note you'll see, and I think in the Zoom window, there's a possibility for receiving the translation services. For an inexplicable reason, it says Spanish, but it's actually translation to Arabic for those of you on the call that would like to hear the panel in Arabic. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is turn the floor over to Alex and Hyatt to begin with the first presentation on our XCEPT research. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Ruth, and thanks everyone for taking the time to join us today. I'll just start off briefly by discussing the purpose underpinning XCEPT's research in Northeast Syria. So adolescents, or children aged 12 to 18 years old, growing up in formerly Daesh-held regions of Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, face really immense challenges. They're forced to navigate the typical challenges of physical, emotional, and psychological growth within a complex conflict environment that's far from typical. Most can't remember a time before the outbreak of violence in 2011. In more than the decades since, cycles of violent conflict have left them traumatized and vulnerable, just as the region's security begins to deteriorate again and economic and humanitarian crises deepen. These experiences have profoundly shaped their lives and outlooks, and it's in this context that XCEPT and our research partners, ABC and Mari for Development, undertook a study over the past year to understand the impacts of conflict and violent extremism on adolescents in the region. So today, my colleague Hyde and I will first briefly discuss our research approach, including some observations on the challenges inherent to data collection in Northeast Syria and how this shaped our research methodology. Then we'll share some key takeaways from our research and offer considerations for programming to wrap up before handing over to our other panelists. So next slide. So for this research, we and our research partners set out to better understand how conflict and violent extremism affects the lives of adolescents in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. You can see the questions guiding our research on this slide. Next, we used a mixed methods approach, including expert and field interviews, a household survey, and workshops to collect data from a variety of sources. The different methods are shown here. This research took place in the area shaded on the map in Northeast Syria, specifically within Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. And if you click through to the next slide, you can see here our field locations on the slide. We chose a mix of both urban areas in Raqqa city and rural areas in western and eastern Deir ez-Zor. On the right, highlighted in green, you can see the areas where we conducted our research. These communities were selected for data collection based on a number of factors, including their prior experience under Daesh control, relative accessibility for research and programming, variance between urban and rural locations, and divergent levels of access to foreign assistance. So just a quick note on the lines of control, which may be familiar to many of you. All of our research took place in areas that were controlled by the Syrian Democratic Forces or the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria, shaded in yellow here. Next slide. Before we delve into the findings, I'll share here some brief observations on the context and challenges that shaped our research approach. So first off, we were unable to conduct in-person field research in areas of higher security risk. Research took place at a time when there were rising security incidents, and constraints prevented physical access for researchers in areas where extremist activity or influence were assessed to be relatively higher. Notably, this was the case for Eastern Deir ez-Zor. Instead, we were able to conduct a limited number of remote interviews with individuals residing in those communities to shed light on dynamics there. In our piloting of research tools, several aspects of face-to-face qualitative interviews with adolescents proved challenging. Children really struggled to articulate their emotions and respond to open questions. Parental presence and at times interference presented an issue for data collection. It's also important to note that we were conducting a study of adolescents generally, not radicalized adolescents specifically. And this framed how we asked certain sensitive questions. So all of these factors required us to think carefully about how to elicit data while maintaining conflict and trauma sensitivity and adhering to ethical standards. In response, we developed a workshop-based focus group activity, created a safe space for adolescents to share their life stories, reflect on their perceptions of and outlook for the world around them. And this proved to be an effective method for engaging adolescents in our data collection process. Then we engaged parents, teachers, and civil society representatives who worked with adolescents alongside community leaders in the field study locations through qualitative interviews to gain further insights into adolescent experiences and behavior. To avoid re-traumatization and stigmatization associated with discussing Daesh, we pared down our survey instrument to focus on adolescent views of the effects of conflict on their lives and hopes for the future. Finally, research with adolescents in this region is challenging in general due to inherent risks of security, stigmatization, speculation, or potentially evasion on sensitive issues, as well as a potential desire to please the interviewers. So we've accounted for this in our analysis of the data. To brief you on some of the key findings of this research, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Hyde now.
Thanks, Alex. Well, I will mainly focus on the impact of conflict and violent extremism on adolescents in northeastern Syria. We have a few observations that I will present now. The first one is related to adolescents and their perception and behavior towards violence. Adolescents appear to have normalized or become somewhat desensitized to violence within their communities, and this affects their behavior. Guns in particular have become common. In some locations, it's not unusual for adolescents to carry guns, which can be seen as representing status or manhood in a militarized society. Guns have also been used in play, resulting at times in accidental death. Guns have often been used to resolve disputes between both adolescents and adults. Click. Fear of Daesh runs high in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. Despite the group's territorial defeat, people are more scared of Daesh now than in the past few years since liberation, a trend backed by data on rising insecurity. While its influence is far diminished, the group remains active in the region, particularly in Deir ez-Zor. Sleeper cells conduct targeted assassinations and intimidate or extort residents with increasing frequency. Many respondents were hesitant to discuss Daesh at all, which may in part be explained by fear of reprisals. Okay. In areas where we conducted field research, community support for Daesh appears to be low. Most adolescents who were willing to discuss the subject expressed opposition to Daesh, particularly to the group's brutal methods. There were only a few who felt that the security, economic, or religious conditions were better under the group's rule. Notably, a focus group of 15 to 18-year-old boy returnees from the Al-Hol camp generally spoke positively about life under Daesh. They highlighted that the security situation and living conditions were significantly better. Their views on life post-ISIS were generally negative. They were forcibly displaced for up to 3 years. Their homes were destroyed, and they lived in extremely bad living conditions in the Al-Hol camp. They are all out of school, and most of them do not have jobs. Click. Adolescents' engagement with and recruitment by Daesh appear to be minimal, occurring at much lower rates than at the height of the group's power between 2014 and 2019. All participants in the adolescents' workshops, nearly all adult interviewees, and 2/3 of the experts interviewed described minimal levels of adolescent mobilization, if any at all. Some experts claim that a limited number of adolescent operatives are used for logistical tasks, such as transporting equipment, rather than necessarily being members of the organization. Often they are not even aware on whose behalf they are carrying out these tasks. Next slide, please. The research did not uncover a clear set of factors that might drive adolescents toward violent extremism. This may reflect the absence of a single pathway toward radicalization. Rather, we looked at a range of contextual, individual, or community factors that can act upon adolescents in different ways. We found that adolescents' lives and outlooks in Northeast Syria are concretely shaped by the civil conflict, both its causes and effects, notably weak governance, dire economic conditions, inefficient service delivery, insecurity, and repression. I will offer a few key takeaways from the research. Click. Lack of trust in governance actors contributes to a sense of marginalization among adolescents. Adolescents' sense of agency, violence, and participation in local affairs are stifled by an inefficient, ideologically driven apparatus that does not meet their needs. Click. A worsening economic crisis limits adolescents' options as their families struggle to provide, with many forced to leave school to work. Women and girls in particular suffer increased burdens such as early marriage, restrictions on movement, and economic pressure to provide for their families. Click. These challenges, alongside deteriorating security conditions, particularly in Deir ez-Zor, contribute to a sense of uncertainty and diminished hopes for the future. Adolescents and adults alike engaged through our research cited a sense of despair and the inability to imagine a future beyond their current reality. Respondents reported the prominence of coping mechanisms, especially drug abuse, and a desire to immigrate among the region's youth. Most adolescents, including 90% of our adolescent survey sample, have had to flee their homes at least once since the start of the conflict, an experience that they associated with feelings of loss and isolation. IDP children who return to their home communities, and particularly those from IDP camps housing perceived Daesh members and their families face significant stigma and barriers to reintegration. These factors, if unaddressed, can drive sympathy for or involvement in violent extremism in two primary ways. The first is that they provide grievances and a desire for change, perhaps leading some to feel that Daesh should be given another chance. Note that Daesh does not need to do anything proactive for this mechanism to work. The second is instances where Daesh is able to do something proactive to exploit these grievances. For example, offering a salary, providing security, or offering less corrupt governance. Next slide, please. Some factors that may enable involvement in violent extremism can also mitigate it and promote resilience. Click. In trying to understand what might drive adolescents towards violent extremism in a conflict context, as well as to understand what might help strengthen their resilience against it, we found that some key factors acting upon adolescents could operate in either direction. Click. Families and social connections, for example, can be critical enablers for adolescent radicalization. They also can be havens for support and social cohesion that helps you navigate instability. Click. Prior negative experience under Daesh's rule and the subsequent destruction of their communities, homes, or livelihoods during the liberation campaign emerged as critical factors that prevented support for the group amongst most people engaged in our research. However, a limited few viewed the period under Daesh's rule positively, expressing nostalgia for conditions that they perceived to be better under its rule, i.e. security, economy, morality. Finally, the research showed that mix of factors influencing behavior can change over time and even alter how a single factor operates. Click. Relevance, depending on the context, some forces can, at one point in time, increase adolescents' vulnerability to Daesh, and at another, decrease vulnerability and strengthen resilience against Daesh. Click. Our research confirms that during the height of Daesh's rule, recruitment to the group was in part driven by the need for protection or the aspiration for status, belonging or power. Click. Today, engagement with Daesh at the limited levels we encountered is more likely to be driven by material incentives such as monetary need, revenge, for example, the desire to strike out against the SDF or coalition for the role in the death of a loved one, and to a lesser degree, ideology. Click. Of course, it's important to note that the relative importance of these factors may change again in the future, especially if there is a Daesh resurgence in the region. Hand over to Alex. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Haid. So I'll just quickly wrap us up here with some considerations for designing programming to address these issues. So as noted at the start, we undertook this research to inform thinking about the types of stabilization, peace building, and development interventions needed to support youth in conflict contexts and build resilience against violent extremism. So by that, I mean illustrative, Yeah, so illustrative interventions could include supporting formal education as well as non-formal education, including activities that aim to improve social and emotional learning outcomes. We'll talk more about education, I'm sure, in other panelist presentations, as well as our discussion session. Community engagement and dialogue to improve adolescents' sense of agency, or livelihood generation activities to help improve the prospects for the future. So based on our field research, we want to offer some specific considerations to inform program design. If you click to the first one. So bespoke, locally grounded solutions are necessary to mitigate the drivers of violent extremism, which differ between individuals and contexts. Next. We would encourage program designers and policymakers to avoid overtly framing activities as related to preventing or countering violent extremism, as this raises risks for participants who could be targeted by Daesh or stigmatized or marginalized for their participation in PCV programs. There's also the risk of potential pushback from communities resistant to this work if it's done overtly. And we would argue that those objectives can still be achieved without using that terminology. Building flexibility and piloting into programs enables adapting to support rapid localized scale-up where projects achieve success. Similarly, identifying entry points for community engagement and quick wins is key to establishing trust at the onset of programming to build a foundation for longer-term engagement. Next. Adopting a whole child approach to programming, acknowledging the importance of the entire ecosystem surrounding the child, rather than addressing their needs in isolation. Next. Where possible, mainstreaming mental health and psychosocial support throughout a range of interventions. However, we're also mindful of the limitations on referral services where these exist, and programming should adjust accordingly. Finally, we strongly recommend that implementers design programming that empowers and gives agency to adolescents, engaging young people meaningfully in the process of identifying and organizing opportunities for positive interaction in their communities. This can reduce the sense of powerlessness or grievance that extremists often seek to exploit. That'll wrap it up, and look forward to discussing more in the questions.
Thanks, Alex and Hyatt. We're going to move on to the next panel. I'll just note in the slightly complex Zoom construct, in the Q&A for Alex Hyatt and the XCEPT research team, you'll see that Rachel asked some specific questions about your research, and we can come back to them in the Q&A on how girls were accessed, what were the specific observations raised by girls and some of the challenges, and then also a bit of a discussion on what you observed in terms of education underway and any challenges in access to education. What we'd like to do now is go to the second geography, across the border into Iraq, and ask Professor Kelsey Shanks to talk to us about another research also among adolescents, also in areas, former Daesh-controlled areas, and some education program design and the considerations raised by the research that she undertook in Iraq. Kelsey, if you want to come on screen and share some considerations.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen if possible. Has that worked?
It has, yes.
Okay, now I need to put my video on. I don't know how to do that. Sorry. I might have to stop sharing to do that. Should I just continue?
Yeah, you should be able to see the video camera on the top of the bottom of your screen. Oh, I know. Yeah, it's because you're at full screen, or maybe go to non-full screen mode.
Here we go. Let me do it this way. And I'll start sharing again. Excuse me.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, thank you for the introduction, Ruth, and thank you also for the invitation to present on my research findings. As requested, I'm going to talk for about 10 minutes on our research with adolescents from areas previously held by ISIS in Iraq. The work is a collaboration with my colleague Benoit Martin, who should also be on the call. We've been working together on this since 2018 under various different project headings. Ben is also a PhD student at Ulster, and she's conducting some really fascinating research on the role of education in northeast Syria for her thesis. So I'm hoping she'll be able to contribute to the discussion as well. So our work in Iraq, which has come under a PVE heading, I'm going to discuss sort of 3 points in relation to this, and they're going to pick up very heavily on Alex's second policy recommendation in terms of not using overt PVE language, because in Iraq that's often the case. So firstly, I'm going to reflect on how we've problematized the use of PVE language in Iraq. Secondly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the conceptual framework that we've applied as an alternative. And lastly, I'm going to give an example of a programme that we've designed for UNESCO, very specifically looking at education access. So first, problemising the terminology. So this section will echo a lot of the previous presentation that covered Syria. So while we wanted to work on this topic and we support the objectives of many youth-focused PVE projects, we've really struggled with the use of the PVE language and actually the rigidity of funders who insist on its visible use in programming. We believe that the term resilience to violent extremism moves the attention away from the potential role of youth, the positive role of youth in society, and instead it places the emphasis on ensuring that they aren't a security threat. We suggest that this threat-based framing actually works to limit community reconciliation in contexts that have experienced extremist violence. But even more significantly, we seriously reject the labelling of any programme as PVE in a highly securitized or insecure context. To give some context to that statement, I just want to talk a little bit about how the situation in Iraq and emphasise the fact that where the rule of law is questionable, such language can be used in a really harmful way, both at the individual, community and national levels. So going back to Iraq, the campaign to remove ISIS concluded in 2017, but the counterinsurgency operations to identify ISIS members have continued for years. And it's really important that we understand this process if we want to work on anything with youth and extremism. So to give you just 4 brief points to make this kind of more meaningful for you. Number 1, Iraqi law does not distinguish between those who are connected with ISIS in a civilian capacity and those who engaged in military roles. The counter-terrorism laws allowed for a mechanic who was forced into helping repair ISIS vehicles and a fighter who chose to actually be part of the military to receive the same sentence, whether that be life imprisonment or death. Number 2, the Iraqi security forces are made up of a collection of fractured security actors. To identify ISIS members, they had all compiled their own lists through reports and rumours, and there was very little transparency in this process. And number 3, anyone who was related to someone on that list, even quite distant relations, was automatically labelled ISIS family. And consequently, they faced restrictions when trying to access basic services and their rights. And then lastly, number 4, Iraq criminalises ISIS membership for children and youth who are associated with the group. And there's little recognition for the violent indoctrination that they were subjected to. In the context of Iraq, there's just no space for children to be framed as victims, which obviously runs counter to international law that prohibits the recruitment of children into armed groups. So this vague legal definition around who may have been aligned to ISIS and who may not have has created a climate of fear for years after the liberation. Even if you're not labelled as an ISIS family, you're constantly living in fear of being accused of being one. And that's not to say that ISIS had no support base in Mosul. Everyone was against their ideology. You know, of course, that's not the case. But it's also not the case that everybody who stayed did so out of choice. So at an individual level, talking about ISIS or extremism with interviewees or with participants in a programme could have caused extreme harm, fear, re-traumatisation, suspicion from others and stigmatisation, not to mention the possible reaction from different armed groups if they misunderstood the purpose of your programming. At the community level, the meanings between preventing and countering violent extremism is really confused. I think they are actually in general in this sort of field, but preventing is often associated with soft skills and countering leans towards a more security-based approach, But once one of these terms is out there, the two can be very misinterpreted and misconstructed. So we encountered a number of PVE labeled teacher training interventions that were effectively training teachers to identify suspected ISIS affiliated students, which for us was just appalling. You know, the security driven intervention should go nowhere near schools. Then at the national level, there are PVE, not countering, steering groups that have seen security members trying to gain access and attendance because of this kind of confused terminology that is circling in Iraq. And this comes down to implementing partners as well, who use the two terms interchangeably. And at the end of the day, it's a globally imposed terminology, and the meanings of both are quite highly debated. So when PV terminology hits the ground in a securitized context, there's so many things that can go wrong. Even if implementing researchers or organizations are hugely competent, the cascade effect into the community can be really dangerous. So our second point to cover is to introduce our preferred conceptual framework, which won't be new to you, I'm sure. We know that there are a myriad of interlinked push factors towards extremism for youth. And a lot of these originate in young people being vulnerable to harm or being poorly protected from exploitation. So in order to move away from the risks associated with the PVE language, which in our case the funder was insisting upon, we instead used a vulnerability-focused conceptual framing. So vulnerability can obviously occur from the denial of material services and needs, through a lack of psychological or emotional support, and through the absence of a sense of belonging and community. So these are all things that were echoed in the previous presentation. And these vulnerabilities can lead to exploitation, abuse, the use of negative coping mechanisms such as child labour, early marriage, or recruitment into armed groups. And by framing our work in the need to address these vulnerabilities, it helps to support an environment that's more focused on reconciliation than blame, because the minute the word extremism is involved in a youth intervention, blame comes into play. But that's not to say that at a funding level, when removed from the context, we can't also acknowledge the link back to PVE objectives, because we know that when good governance is absent, when human rights are violated and young people have no hope for the future, they're going to be more susceptible to the narratives of grievance and injustice and promised empowerment, and generally somebody who offers to help them. And this was the narrative that ISIS sold to gain access to Mosul in the first place. So moving on to point 3, I'm just going to talk a little bit of the framing in practice. So using the vulnerability framework, we conducted extensive research to inform a PVE education intervention in areas formerly held by ISIS. I'd be happy to talk about the methodology, but I'll skip over it now and maybe come back to it in questions if needed. We found that beyond the normal conflict-related restrictions to education, our target group were experiencing 4 key issues that impacted their education access further. So number 1 is the vague legality of ISIS membership and accusations of being ISIS families, because this prevented families from renewing or replacing their essential ID documents that were needed to access social services and education enrolment. Number 2, young people from this region were grappling with a huge learning deficit due to so many years out of school under ISIS and then living in camps that were really poorly serviced. Number 3, the normalisation of violence in schools had increased considerably. Corporal punishment was already quite common, but the violence had escalated, and largely due to untreated teacher trauma and students' disruptive behaviour because of trauma. And lastly, orphans and children with any connection to a family with perceived affiliation to ISIS faced community rejection and rejection in the school environment. So our designed intervention combined partial responses to 2, 3 and 4, because number 1 was obviously a legal issue and needed advocacy at the government level. So it was a teacher training programme that focused on inclusion to help combat the feelings of isolation when children weren't able to keep up with the curriculum or rejected by the community. It included modules on well-being, so teachers could better understand that misbehaviour might be associated to trauma. And it includes modules on positive discipline, trying to address the normalisation of violence in the classroom. But we were very aware that such trainings have been delivered across Iraq numerous times by a range of actors over many years. And most of them have failed to make an impact, and largely not because they weren't good programs, but because there are really strong social norms in Iraq around corporal punishment and its advantages as they're seen. And also the expected exclusion for academic failure. You know, children are not allowed to fail, and they'll be sent to the back of the class when they do. They won't be encouraged to come up front and helped. So in order to overcome these obstacles, we did actually turn back to a very subtle PVE hook for teachers, but very much through a framing of vulnerability. So in the introduction to the training, we included a storyboard, which the facilitator was supposed to tell, and has now been made into an actual video. And it tells the story of a boy named Ahmed, who is 7 years old when ISIS take Mosul. It takes you through his childhood and the events of his life, the grief, the violence he's exposed to, the loss, the restricted access to education, the life in an IDP camp where he couldn't leave, the return to Mosul, and then the fact that he has to work to support his family. Alongside this, it shows his continuing desire to go to school. But it also shows that in every class, the age-appropriate curriculum is too advanced for him. He falls asleep because he's been working. And every day he's punished, whether that's with violence or being excluded from the classroom, or whether he's just called stupid. And it shows how he becomes more isolated, more alone, and more frustrated. It shows him dropping out of school, becoming a daily wage earner at a young age. And then at the end, it shows a stranger offering him power and status, something that he hasn't had. And as previous presentation said, there's a hypermasculinity in this post-ISIS environment. It doesn't specify who this person is, so it could be interpreted as a criminal gang, it could be interpreted as somebody trying to bring him into child labour. It doesn't really specify that, it just tries to show how vulnerable life has made him. And then this story goes back in time and shows concrete actions that teachers could have taken to help Ahmed along the way. And the rest of the training links into these actions. So different teaching practices that could be employed and different forms of discipline. So we're not saying that children shouldn't be disciplined in school, but there are positive ways to do it. And relating back to how we could have changed the path of Ahmed's life. So far, it's been quite well received, but obviously we won't know if it will have any impact, or because behavioural change takes a long time. But we're quite hopeful, and the ministry seems to have picked up on it in, like I said, creative videos, an introductory video, and then small videos to go along with each module. The school guide and the training facilitation guide and the videos will all be open access, and they'll be shared on our website, the Iraqi Schools Project, very soon. So I will leave it there. This is how we've worked, and we hope that there is some transferable learning to other contexts that are suffering from, complexities of insecurity in the post-extremist environment. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelsey. That's a very interesting presentation. Definitely there were some questions coming up while you were speaking. You'll see them both in the chat and well, primarily in the chat, actually, about whether that vulnerability framework that you identified, whether you linked it at all to aspects of education before or during periods of ISIS control, which is something possibly to consider. Another thing we might come back to when we get to the Q&A is thinking about when you thought about the vulnerability framework, you and Benoit, had you thought about applications or interventions that went outside the formal education space, to non-formal education, to informal venues, other ways to apply some of the learning and the research findings to various interventions? Before we go to that, let's turn to Caroline and come back to Northeast Syria for the Mercy Corps, some Mercy Corps pilot research and programming in Northeast Syria that relates to kind of, I think she termed it as community-driven and community research programming based on community engagement. So Carolyn, if you want to come on screen and walk through some of what you found during those various pilot programs, we'll then come back in the Q&A and try to put it all the pieces together. Carolyn.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you for inviting Mercy Corps to be part of today's presentation. I am going to start, possibly foolishly, by testing my technical abilities. And I'm going to start, hopefully, by sharing with you a video. And this video, as will become clear, has been as part of one of our projects. So please let me know if you can hear this.
You can see it, but I can't hear it yet. I think we're still seeing it versus hearing it, but it might be okay. You're on mute, Carolyn.
Rookie error. I'll come back to the video shortly, and I am just going to share my slides for today.
We can see them.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to talk today about contributing to stability in northeast Syria. And our initial conversations with the donor started in 2020 and focused on northeast Syria and the prevention of violent extremism and understanding those root causes, specifically as they related to recruitment and the risks and vulnerabilities for those within communities. Our programme focused on 4 areas. Firstly, analysing the dynamics of conflict, governance and displacement and their effect on violent extremism. Supporting civil society to design pilot initiatives that could contribute to community level stability, social cohesion, inclusive development and the prevention of violent extremism. Testing those pilot initiatives to build evidence for the implementation of longer term initiatives to improve stability and prevent VE. And fourthly, the provision of recommendations on how civil society can contribute to these areas. We were driven by 4 research questions underlying political, governance, economic, social, ecological and security drivers, how different marginalised groups experienced violence and instability, the coping mechanisms and capacities for peace and stability in communities, and prospective approaches and opportunities for investing in that peace and stability. Our initial framing and hypothesis was based on desk research and initial participatory analysis sessions. We focused on themes including lack of accountability by authorities, lack of dignity and self-realisation, fragile social cohesion and feelings of insecurity, also in the knowledge that none of these can be addressed without acknowledging the intersections of each. We looked at social capital, behaviour change and system change. And this was in the knowledge that these do not take place within a vacuum, but within a larger context of severe political and economic challenges. We had, as I said, the 4 research questions, and in terms of locations, we started off with more areas across northeast Syria, and then when we came to working on these pilot interventions, we identified 3 areas. Firstly, Raqqa city in Raqqa, where the pilot intervention was a collaboration between host and returnee youth to advocate for their needs. In Tel Tamar to the north, in Hasaka, where we worked with CSOs and young people to establish a multi-ethnic youth platform to engage with local government. And then in Hajin in Deir ez-Zor, where the intervention focused on the development of local strategies to reduce the use of small arms and address the normalization of violence. And when we say we work with young people, this was roughly people between the ages of 18 and 28, although it varied depending on the local area. And our approach started with training a cohort of community researchers who undertook significant qualitative research, which formed the foundation of these pilot studies. We had workshops with the community researchers and the CSOs that we partnered with, and this led to the development of theories of change, and then the 3 pilot interventions, which were based on collected and collective knowledge and the understanding of the stresses and needs in each location. The CSOs then implemented the projects, and we provided capacity building with CSOs across the project lifetime. I'm going to talk about one project in particular, and this was in Hajin in Deir ez-Zor. And we started out with reaching to and getting the support of the tribal leaders. Consultations were then facilitated by the CSO with the tribal leaders and 3 community activist groups who were selected from volunteers when we started out with this project. And the harmful effects of carrying small arms was the chosen subject of discussion. And these discussion meetings and engagements identified recommendations around addressing the weapons issue, and were followed by broader community consultations, the creation of an action plan, and identification of recommendations for implementation. These discussions were supported by awareness sessions, media training for journalists, conflict transformation training, advertisements, brochure distribution, and the video that you have just seen. So the local authorities paid for the creation of this video based on this process of consultation, identification of recommendation, and commitments to take forward some of these recommendations, which included no carriage of weapons outside working hours, deterrence laws, and installation of cameras. Overall, the project provided youth and women with the opportunity to take part in activism with authorities, participate in decision-making on a sensitive and essential topic that was of marked concern in this community. And our learning for this particular project included the fact that young people were more empowered, confident, and engaged than our initial research had indicated. The importance of qualitative measurement, especially in measuring attitudinal and behaviour change. And we noted that the participants reported improved communication with and trust in tribal and local authorities. And we believe that this shows the potential for more rapid change than otherwise hypothesised. And across all our pilots, our learning demonstrated the fact that work must be evidence-informed. It highlighted the importance of situating work within the community and framing that work as social cohesion rather than as explicitly PVE initiatives. Community inclusion is key. And we noted that the project started to expand beyond their original remits as more communities and stakeholders became engaged. For example, tribal elders from Hajin shared learning with those from Diban. Those tribal elders then held a community awareness meeting and announced that they would also be tackling weapons use. Participants experienced enhanced feelings of belonging, and work points to roots of acceptance of marginalized groups, including those with perceived ISIS affiliation. This was mainly through public demonstration of behavior that contradicted stereotypes, and this helped to start to shift community attitudes. The inclusion of both males and females is important, but the inclusion of all identity groups is needed. We were also aware of the potential for change in other social norms, for example, gender relationships. The development of strong peer-to-peer support heightens the sense of belonging amongst our participants, and the Hajin project also served as an entry point to other discussions, such as the drugs crisis and violence against women. We experienced a greater ability to engage with local authorities, and this was key to the tempo of our projects. So there's greater space than anticipated to collaborate with local authorities on relationships with communities. And there is need for ongoing structural change and relationship building to enable project results to be sustained. I'm now going to show you some of the quotes from our participants, which show change, show desire for integration, show the way in which older people in the community changed their perceptions around young people and the ability of young people to contribute, and then change in self-perception and the ability of participants to themselves help to formulate change. And finally, we find that, and as you've probably noticed, that we are aligning with the XCEPT findings and the findings of the work done in Iraq through Ulster University. And a general alignment includes lack of support for violent extremist organisations and distrust of local authorities. But Mercy Corps also noted the issues of drugs and migration as alternatives for young people, not just VEOs, and the concern with which the issues around drugs and migration were regarded by the communities. The dilemmas about future options as experienced by young people, for example, joining the SDF, the destabilising effect of smuggling and the unequal distribution of resources, and the need to undertake work on issues such as GBV and trauma, but only where there are services that can support, that we can refer to and we can engage with more generally. So in summary, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to share some of our learning, and I look forward to engaging in the discussion with you. So thank you from my side.
Thanks so much, Carolyn. And before we actually open it up, there's been a lot of complimentary observations in these three presentations. What we'd like to do is bring Patrick to the fore to offer us some thoughts from a policy perspective on both the presentations, also some of the challenges raised, some just to get kickstart the discussion when we move to Q&A. Patrick, if you want to come on screen. Thanks.
Yes, I hope I'm on the screen and that you can see me, Ruth, and you can hear me clearly. Yes, great.
Let's see and hear you.
Thank you. Thanks. I will be brief because I see that we've already taken some time. And I think that, I mean, first of all, I want to stress that those presentations were absolutely fascinating. I think that for me, one element which is quite striking is the fact that there is a similarity in assessment of the drivers of violent extremism and on some of the mitigation measures that are suggested. So I think there is quite a lot of similarity on the structural factors, on poor governance, challenging economic situation, on service delivery or insecurity and repression. There's perhaps more diversity in ascertaining individual factors, the social connections, the family peer networks appear to be quite important. Other elements like ideology or material rewards are things that are perhaps less obvious. But what is clear for me coming from those presentations is that there is not a single pathway towards violent extremism, and we know that from other contexts. And we're also clear that the drivers will vary according to the context and individuals, and therefore taking into account the specificity of a context through an area-based approach is key for policymaking and programming. So our programming and policymaking needs to be underpinned by a thorough context and conflict assessment. I think it has been mentioned that it is not a one-off. It needs to be regularly updated as the situation can change. And I think we've heard also very clearly that we should not label any programming as PV programming. So that's well received from a donor point of view. I think that one challenge we have as a donor is the feasibility of applying a holistic approach, addressing both structural and individual factors. The complexity of addressing governance, early recovery, service delivery, including education, is beyond the capacity of most single donors and implementing partners. So division of labor is important, but is very complex. And if we cannot have a holistic approach, then this begs the question of prioritization. Is it possible to prioritize? And is it possible to ascertain what we should focus on as a priority? Question mark, and I don't think that we have a clear answer on that. I think another element which is quite important for the UK government and other donors, in particular in Northeast Syria, this is less relevant for Iraq, is how do we respond to people most in need? I mean, the security issues tend to prevent access to some districts, in particular in Northeast Syria. So should we strengthen our work in locations where stabilization activities are successful at the risk of generating resentment and grievances in other locations? Or do we need to find creative ways to reaching the population most in needs, where access is quite challenging, perhaps by developing creative ways to work with local partners who are able to access difficult locations. A point also which is complex is we all agree on the importance of women empowerment, but how do you address women empowerment in a sensitive way, especially when we've been confronted with a Daesh culture of masculinity? Some people are speaking about hyper-masculinity. And the status of men can be associated with a culture of violence, of possession of guns, as that has been discussed by various presenters. And finally, I will stop with the element which is important for the UK in terms of the specificity of individuals who have been linked with ISIS and might be ostracized and rejected by community. So they do present a specific risk for the future, and that they can have some specific needs that need to be addressed in our policy and programming. And I will stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. That was a really useful wrap up in a way, and it helped bring out some of the major themes of all the presentations. And some of the things I was also thinking that we might want to come back to. So there have been some specific questions in the question and answer or chat for some of the presenters about the way they did their work. I think there's definitely, in a second, we should come back to this question of reaching girls and some of the observations they raised. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the last question as I'm talking. But before we do so, maybe we pick up what Louise asked via Lydia in the Q&A, and Patrick touched upon it as well, this concept of a holistic approach. And then because all the research seems to show that the factors are variable, the drivers can relate to your experience of conflict. They can relate to your current stresses in your life. They can relate to how you've engaged with potentially conflict or violent extremist actors when you're thinking about drivers for resurgent violence. So I'd like to kick it back in a way to the researchers to share this, to see if there's a way to answer this question on that prioritization. If you, and specifically if you think about a group, if we take youth, maybe, it's like 10 to 24. So that encompasses both the group that Mercy Corps addressed and Kelsey and the XCEPT team had researched. We have some examples here of specific types of programming to send messages to both youth and also those that engage with them. But have you thought beyond, it comes back to the question I asked Kelsey, the formal spaces in which you can reach this age group to the informal spaces, community spaces, family spaces? Do our panelists or anyone else who wants to offer it in the chat have some observations to offer about ways we can begin to get at the whole of the adolescent or youth in terms of supporting them? And the corollary to that, point two, I'd like to potentially ask some of our colleagues to come online to discuss, is that mental health question that came up at the end of the XCEPT briefing, talking about the importance of mental health and psychosocial support. That would seem to me to be an element of the holistic approach. And we haven't quite yet talked about what some of those key considerations are. So first, kicking it back to our panelists, in case you want to share some observations about alternative interventions that you identified along the way that might be of particular utility with this age group of youth. And maybe we could start, Kelsey, with you in the education, there's formal, non-formal, informal education space, and then possibly turn to the XCEPT team if you discovered in terms of programming in your research some specific aspects that came forward.
Sure, so I can kick off and I can reflect on a few of those different questions actually. One of the biggest things we found in that area, specifically with the target group we were working with, was this knowledge gap, that it was impossible to integrate back into the school for many of the kids. And that also created a lot of stress for the teachers because they were working with curriculum that was far beyond the children they had to teach. And there were parallel informal education sort of catch-up interventions, but they weren't accredited. So when it comes to the actual educational certificates, rather than looking at the informal, I personally think the unaccredited sort of catch-up classes, while they work to work against illiteracy and improve numeracy, they don't actually solve one of the major problems for this community, which is they want to get their high school certificate, and there's no way to do it. So one of the biggest things needed in Iraq is catch-up classes for that entire community, because there's a whole generation of adolescents, if not two, that have one that's aged out of education and it's too late and they won't ever get their certificates, and a lot of them are illiterate, and one that is still going through but struggling. So bringing them up to the ability to be able to pass them, whether that means they stay in school longer, they bring back in 20-year-olds who had their entire adolescence in this situation. So that's the first thing, is the kind of the very practical elements of education. Education can also, though, offer a sense of community, and that can then go out into the informal. That doesn't have to be done in schools. There are interventions that can, like youth clubs, that can create that sense of community and bring people in. Because as I said in our research, that vulnerability factor of being isolated and not seeing any routes out of your situation was one of the huge factors. So yeah, I think that can go across both the informal and the formal. But education in this respect has multiple different inputs that would go into that holistic view of a child and trying to support that. The trouble is that doesn't work if there's no economic opportunities afterwards. So kids won't stay in school if they see people graduating from school and then still being a daily wage earner. It's not going to keep them in school. So as you've said, they're all very interlinked. And I'm not sure I have any of the answers for that, other than a very holistic funding pot that can be working across a region or a town, a very geographical kind of location. And I think that was said in the first presentation as well. So I'll stop there, sorry.
Thanks, Kelsey. Alex, did you want to come on?
Sure, I'll just come on really briefly to echo what Kelsey was saying there about adopting that whole child approach to programming and addressing the range of vulnerabilities. I think it's interesting, Kelsey, the point that you were raising about not just poor quality of educational services that undermine learning outcomes for children, but also that unaccredited aspect of education. That's certainly an issue that adolescents face in their education system in the northeast of Syria, which is run by the autonomous administration there. It came across consistently, both in our research as well as others from the literature, that the inability to obtain recognized certificates, at least for students that are unable to pay for private tuition and travel across line to regime areas to sit exams, for regime accredited certificates, really undermines their ability to then access the benefits that come with an accredited education. And that has implications for livelihoods, that has implications for social status within the community as well. So that's a really big issue that just shows how integrated education is with wider opportunities for adolescents. But at the same time, as you said, there really are significant pressures to drop out, particularly economic for adolescents. We found that dropout rates were relatively high, particularly for boys. A majority of boys were out of school that we surveyed, and nearly a majority of girls. And that rose to majority for both from the ages of 15 up until 18, where you saw kind of this decline in enrollment. And a lot of that was linked to the need to seek employment, even if it was daily wage labor, just to support their families. So it just points to this wider whole of child approach and the need to look at, as you said, those kind of non-formal opportunities to promote social emotional learning, for example, catch-up programs that do help bridge that gap and encourage kids to stay in school. So I'll jump off, and I see Shadi, our research lead for this project, actually has her hand up as well.
Shadi, if we can enable your mic, go ahead.
Yes, I hope you hear me fine. Hi, my name is Shadi, and I was the research lead for this project we did with XCEPT. I just wanted to come in and talk a little bit about, there was a question in the chat about if we reached adolescent girls and how we did that, and kind of their point of view, because I think this is a little bit different than the boys. And so we were able to engage adolescent girls of the same age group, 12 to 18, for when we did adolescent workshops. And so we did boys and girls, we were actually able to do mixed workshops between the ages of 12 and 14, but the 15 to 18, we separated them out, of course. And the discussions that were had with these adolescent girls, especially of the older age group who had, at least spent 5 years under ISIS control or 4, and they all spoke of this lost education. So and the inability to catch up. So a few of them had been lucky this does have to do with like socioeconomic situation of these girls, but there are, you know, some opportunities for catch-up classes, but they are private institutions and not in the public system. There is an opportunity to take these 9th grade and 12th grade exams, as Alex mentioned, going cross-line. But of course, this is really just for the few who are able to do that, both economically and just also politically. But the rest just spoke about the importance of school for them as a method of being out of the household. So it didn't actually tie into the opportunities, livelihood opportunities that would come after having an education, but it was more of the social and being able to leave the house, have a social group through which they gain, you know, obviously they're happier, they're out with friends, but also they gain information from those social groups and just feel more integrated in their community. So they feel totally isolated in the household where there's actually no opportunity to go out, education being that only opportunity out of the household for them. So that wasn't necessarily their constant ask of a possibility of education was not necessarily for, you know, livelihood opportunities afterwards, or, you know, really, I mean, they do care, of course, it would be better to have accredited certificates, but it was really for that social interaction and that reintegration into a community and outside of the household, basically. So that came up a lot. And I'm actually in Northeast Syria now working on another project, but it was with women in Al-Hol. And for them, I mean, it's the same thing that comes up over and over again. I mean, if you give us opportunities to go outside of the household, even just to hang out and talk, we just feel like, you know, 100 times better. So for psychosocial support, kind of those that is a big thing that women keep asking for. And so again, when we talked about access constraints, I do know there are access constraints in Northeast Syria. It's difficult to reach certain areas. But in the end, there is the opportunity to do different kinds of programming that could actually make a huge difference. So I don't always buy the access constraint, you know, kind of reason for not going to certain areas. There are local organizations working almost in all of these areas. Of course, again, there are donor and logistical considerations. So I'm not naive to those. But there is always possibility. And again, especially with girls, I feel like very little goes a very long way for these women. And there is a way to access them. I mean, again, talking to some of these NGOs that work in Al-Hol camp, where it's, you know, as extreme as it can get in terms of, you know, social norms, they still are able to go and do things intense with girls and engage them in one way or another. So I think creatively, there's always kind of an opportunity there.
That's a great. Thanks, Shadi. Those are both great observations, particularly like the final point about really thinking creatively and working with local organizations about how you can access these communities in need. What I'd like to do is pick up on your point about, you know, how 18-year-olds spoke about what it felt like to be able to get out of the house and engage with others, this psychosocial support question, because again, coming back to the whole of youth, whole of adolescent or child programming, this seems to be a key aspect. It's a traumatized population. It's one that's dealt with more than a decade of violence. And I'm wondering if we have some colleagues that we know have undertaken some research in Northeast Syria and kind of tested approaches on psychosocial support. It might get a little bit at Nicole's early question in the chat on feedback loops, what you learn from piloting some programming, and then how it causes you to adjust. I'm wondering, Michelle Bradford, are you listening and able to offer a comment or two on what you learned about psychosocial support based on research in Northeast Syria?
Absolutely, Ruth. I'm happy to participate. So the program that we ran in Northeast Syria for 4 years, we were an education stabilization program. We worked in non-formal, informal, and the formal sector. And we worked on social reintegration that did have programming that was similar to PVE type programming. And we also integrated psychosocial support programming into our education service delivery. And so we did quite a robust amount of research around pilots for both our social reintegration and psychosocial support programming. And what I can say on the psychosocial support programming is that we, and just to follow on Shadi's comment, we also did not find a number of challenges in terms of geographical access, and in terms of our research, we were able to conduct face-to-face interviews with program participants, even in al-Bahuz, Eastern Deir ez-Zor, which was, of course, ISIS's last part of the caliphate. So I think what was most successful in terms of our psychosocial support programming was a trauma recovery program that engaged both youth, but really, I would say ages like 8 to through teenage years through 18, alongside their caregivers. And so we did programming for the caregivers, with the children, and then together as family units. The content of our programming, half of it was very much focused on trauma recovery, and the other half was on social and emotional learning and other aspects of psychosocial support programming. And in terms of our research, we had very significant findings in the first cohort of our pilot. So, for example, we had 27 indicators of well-being. We saw statistically significant improvements for children across all 27 indicators. And then for caregivers, we found significant improvements in 25 of the 27 indicators. And I think another really critical factor, or just indicator of the success of our program, was that we asked people to report on 5 symptoms of trauma, from sleep disturbances to kind of avoidance, feeling startled, having intrusive thoughts, and experiencing intrusive images. And we asked both children and caregivers to self-report how many times they were experiencing those 5 symptoms at the start of, or before the start of the program, and then after the program. It was an 8-week program, so it was very short in duration. And we saw extremely significant decreases across all 5 with both children and caregivers. So I think, from that perspective, our takeaway is that psychosocial support can absolutely be mainstreamed through a variety of education models and in different service delivery contexts. And that there should be an approach that engages primary caregivers and works with sibling groups as well, and that we can conduct robust research, both qualitative and quantitative, to capture the impacts of the program, to contribute to evidence, and to inform future programming. Thanks, Ruth.
Thanks, Michelle. That's really interesting, especially your point about caregivers, family members, others that can benefit from the programming alongside child, adolescent, or youth. Shadi, I know your hand is up again. I think, do you have a specific point in response to Michelle, or are you looking to answer Kobe's question in the Q&A? Or are you just taking your hand down? Shadi might just be taking her hand down. Thank you. Okay, so there's still a lot more to do here, I think, and we might come back to the issues of normalization of violence, and also, and it may be a question from Mercy Corps, and I guess the observations from the XCEPT team. Both of you were really focused on this concept, and it came up in the Q&A. Normalization of violence, prevalence of weapons, youth and adolescents carrying weapons, it's becoming a symbol of status. Did you get far enough, Mercy Corps, to see, how this might have impacted youth behavior running the pilot program in terms of the receptivity? Are you not there yet? For the XCEPT team, did you have observations, whether it was from the expert interviews that you undertook, from from teachers or community leaders that you engaged with, about the ways to sort of alter current norms among youth about what it means to have a weapon at your side, and where that could lead in terms of potential future violence? So maybe start with Caroline, if you have a thought on that.
Thank you. So firstly, this particular initiative was identified by young people. So it very much came from the young people who identified it as an area of key concern in their communities. And then the design and implementation of that project took place with the young people who were acting in groups, who communicated with local authorities, with tribal leaders. So there was that appetite to see this change. We saw pushback against some of the recommendations. So, for example, one of the recommendations was that people under 30 couldn't carry weapons. And this got a lot of pushback at the start, but actually as the discussions developed, minds were changed, and it was agreed that there would be this age limit to, or age threshold to carrying weapons. The programs or the implementation of the pilots is only just finished, and we have seen a commitment to the recommendations in Hajin, and we are going to go back to see if these recommendations have actually been followed, as local authorities have identified that they should be. And just to add that we see that as other symbols of respect are being denied young people, so for example, marriage ages are changing, and marriage is a significant threshold for young people in Syria. It is when they're seen to enter adulthood, etc. And if young people are not able to marry, and therefore are denied this particular route to acceptance, then it is likely that we may see other behaviours taking place, and this may be one of those areas. So we will go back and see how things are doing as we follow up on this work.
Hi, Alex Shadi. Any on this concept of kids out in the streets? I think there were also some findings related to drugs for your work as well, and they're different. But this concept of, let's say, stick with the concept of weapons. Did your observations parallel what Carolyn has noticed, or did you come up with? Did anyone offer thoughts as to how to at least reduce the prevalence of weapons among youth, and move them away toward assuming violence is an appropriate course of action?
Well, it's as I mentioned earlier, it's a major issue that was raised by many, if not all, adult interviewees, as well as the experts. They have mentioned that, as I highlighted in the presentation, it's quite normal to have adolescents carrying guns. You could have even children as young as 7 years old carrying not only a gun but rifle at some point, playing with those, leading to incidental sort of killing. But also, I think that the other issue is not only when it comes to the culture of carrying guns, but also related to the use of violence among each other. Teachers have highlighted this issue quite frequently. They said that in their classroom, it's quite often that they would see two adolescents just chatting, and then one either just beating the other, or will carry a knife. Teachers have also spoke about the difficulty of them being able to have a chat with adolescents, because there were incidents where students basically started beating up their teachers, and security have had to intervene in order to just pull them away. Now, when it comes to solutions, unfortunately, we have not been able to get enough data on what could be done, because most of them, they were just, I think, just trying to understand the scale of the problem, and they are not finding any solutions. From other research I've done in northeastern Syria, I've noticed that like the Syrian Democratic Forces, that the SDF have been trying at different stages to impose different sort of regulations to prevent the use or carrying arms, celebrity shootings, and all of those. But there is no culture to actually strengthen and enforce those sort of regulations. So they have been largely ineffective. What we need to, I think, start thinking about is how to not only use legislations in order to achieve that objective, but how to change the mentality and work on that slowly through not only families, but also the education system itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Hyatt. I know we have like a minute left. Alex, might you have a 30-second intervention? Otherwise, we probably need to wrap up.
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that with Hyatt, and he was mentioning, the SDF at the end there. Our research was specifically looking at Daesh and the phenomena around that and risks of recruitment. But I think underlying a lot of the research that we conducted in Northeast Syria is this awareness that there's mandatory conscription across the region once adolescents turn 18. And that has knock-on effects for the wider militarization of society. And so whether it's recruitment by Daesh, whether it's recruitment by the SDF or kind of affiliated militia, it's important to keep in mind just how militarized society is, and that shapes the environment that these adolescents are growing up in, and that shapes their reference point. And so again, not offering a solution, but just highlighting the kind of wider aspect of the issue. It's not about one group here, it's about kind of a culture of militarization.
Thank you, Alex. Okay, so we've hit 4 o'clock. We want to try to stick to time. I will note, and if you haven't noticed it from the Q&A and from the chat bar, there's a lot of issues we have actually didn't get a chance to address. There were questions about if tribal interactions could be exploited. I know some of the researchers highlighted that these about exchanges with tribal actors in terms of their positive role as a resilience factor, but we never quite got to are there places where this can be something that can actually help, will still push youth toward violence? There's more to be done on the issue of responding to those in greatest needs. And Patrick raised an important question about where do you put your programming? Do you put it where you can build on structures already there? Or do you try to get access to the areas that are most difficult? And Shadi had a good counter to that, but there's a lot more discussion that could be had about doing that effectively. And particularly another point that Patrick raised about those coming out of those affiliated with Daesh or from families affiliated with Daesh, have we sufficiently sort of addressed the needs of this group in particular? I think there's, again, more to be done on this, and hopefully we can return to it in future discussions, as well as spin out further some of the implications for programming, be it in the education space, livelihood space, development and growth space for youth. And we've covered a broad range from 8 to sort of 24 here to help them feel more positive, optimistic about their future, support the social cohesion, and generally prevent resurgent violence. So I want to thank you all for joining us, joining our researchers today. I want to thank Alex, Hyatt, Kelsey, Carolyn, and the research teams behind them, because we know there were many researchers behind each of these projects. And thank you on behalf of XCEPT. We hope to have you join us again for our next presentation and round of research. Thank you.